7.2c is on using the box method and the greatest common factor. So now that we're more comfortable with finding the greatest common factor and we've practiced using the box method, we're going to put these two skills together. So if you think back to our factoring, it's just reverse multiplication, and we had two steps. And the first step you always need to do is factor out the greatest common factor. Not only does it make the process easier, but you can also come up with the wrong answer if you don't factor out that greatest common factor first. Then, and also you want to make sure the leading coefficient is positive, and that's something we'll talk about. Then after you factor out that greatest common factor, that's when you would break out your box method or your reverse distribution and factor it into your binomials. So again, we've learned these two skills individually. Today we're just putting them together. Looking at letter A, we have 2x cubed plus 14x squared plus 20x. So we're going to start with our greatest common factor. I always like to look at it in parts. So looking at 2, 14, and 20, well, the largest number that goes into all of those is 2. So we could factor a 2 out. Looking at our x's, well, each term has an x, so I know I can factor at least one x out. And since x to the first is the lowest x, that's all I can factor out. So now, remember, basically when we take the greatest common factor out, we're essentially just dividing it out of the problem. So if we have 2x cubed divided by 2x, well, our 2's are gone. And if we had x cubed and we take 1x out, we just have x squared. 14 divided by 2 would be 7, and then we lose an x from that term. And then 20 divided by 2 would be 10, and our x is completely gone. So I'm going to circle my greatest common factor because I need to remember to put that in my answer at the end. But for now, we're just going to look at this x squared plus 7x plus 10 because now we have a trinomial that we can easily factor. Our x squared and our 10 go in our box, and then we're ready for our puzzle. Two numbers that multiply to be a times c and add to be bx. Well, for this problem, a is equal to 1, b is equal to 7, and c is equal to 10. So 1 times 10 tells us we want two numbers that multiply to be 10 and add to be 7. Well, 10 doesn't have that many factors, and looking at it, we can tell right away 2 plus 5 is going to give us 7. So 2 times 5 is 10, 2 plus 5 is 7, and so we know what goes in our box. And hopefully you're getting quicker at this box method. It takes a while at first, but after you practice it and you know what the next step is, it starts to go more smoothly for you. Now we're just factoring. Looking at x squared and 5x, well, we can just factor a 1 out, but we could also factor an x out. Looking at 2x and 10, well, 2 and 10, 2 goes into both of those, and we can't factor an x out because we have an x here, but there is not one in our other box. Oh, I erased way too much. Okay. Then, looking at our columns, x squared and 2x, we can factor an x out. 5x and 10, we can factor a 5 out because 5 goes into 5 and 5 goes into 10. So now we have our binomials. We've got x and a positive 2, and then we've got x plus 5. And remember, we just take those from the top and the side of our box. Here's our x and our positive 2. Here's our x and our positive 5. The last thing you need to remember is to incorporate your greatest common factor. So if we were to factor 2x cubed plus 14x squared plus 20x, we would get 2x times x plus 2 times x plus 5. And that would be our completely factored form. So that's what we're doing. So again, we've looked at both these skills individually, and today we're just taking that greatest common factor and then using that box method. Let's practice a couple more. It would be a good idea to pause just to see how far you can get on your own. Remember, always, 100% of the time start with your greatest common factor. Well, looking at these numbers, notice how our leading coefficient is negative. So I immediately know I'm going to factor a negative out of this problem because I do not want that leading coefficient to be negative. It is a million times easier when that leading coefficient is positive. Then, looking at 12, 56, and 32, I know 2 goes into it, but 4 also goes into it. So I'm actually going to start by factoring out a 4, and then if I need to, I can factor something more out later. And then looking, those first two terms have an x, but that last one doesn't, so we cannot factor an x out. So it looks like we can factor a -4 out. So let's see what happens when we do that. Well, -12 divided by -4 is a +3. Positive 56 divided by -4 would become negative, and 56 divided by 4 would be 14. -32 divided by -4 would be a +8. So looking at 3x squared minus 14x plus 8, well, we have a positive leading coefficient, or +3, so that looks good. We still can't factor a variable out. And looking at 3, 14, and 8, nothing goes into those three numbers, so we can't factor anything else out. So we have our greatest common factor, which means we are ready to use our box method. Now it'd be a good idea to pause and see if you can factor this trinomial for yourself. We want two numbers that multiply to be a times c and add to be bx. Well, in this case, a is 3, b is a -14, and c is a +8. Well, 3 times 8 is 24, and -14. So we want two numbers that multiply to be +24 and add to be -14. Well, 24, again, you can always start by listing the factors. That's always a good idea if you don't know where else to start. Looking at these, the only ones that I could add together to end up with 14 are 2 and 12. But since I want it to be a -14, I need a -2 plus a -12. And again, that part of our puzzle is just trial and error. So you might have to try a couple different ones, and you'll definitely have to practice it a lot before you can become proficient at it. Now we're looking for our greatest common factor. So 3x squared and -12x. Well, this is a +3, so I'm going to factor, this is going to be positive. Looking at 3 and 12, we can factor a 3 out. Looking at x squared and x, we can factor an x out. Then our next row, -2x and 8. Since this is negative, I'm going to factor a negative out. Looking at 2 and 8, I'm going to factor a 2 out. Let's see, 3x squared and -2x. Nothing goes into 3 and -2, but we can factor an x out. Looking at -12x and +8, I'm going to factor a negative out since that first box has a negative. Looking at 12 and 8, I'm going to factor a 4 out. So we have our two binomials. We have a 3x minus 2, and we have x minus 4. Now, last but not least, don't forget or always remember your greatest common factor. Right, so -4 times 3x minus 2 times x minus 4 is our final answer. We're going to look at one more problem. Again, if you haven't yet, this would be the perfect time to pause and see if you can figure this out. It's really important to practice it individually so you know what you're understanding and what you need to ask questions on. We're looking at 6x cubed minus 15x squared minus 9x. The leading coefficient is positive, so I don't have to factor a negative out. Looking at 6, 15, and 9, well, 3 goes into all of those numbers. And then all of these have an x, so we can factor an x out. So we're going to divide everything by 3x and see what happens. Well, that first term would become 2x squared. Then we'd have -5x, and last but not least, -3. Looking at 2x squared minus 5x minus 3, well, nothing goes into 2, -5, and -3, and we can't factor any more variables out. And once you look at it and you don't have any other greatest common factors, that's when you can start your box method. Looking at our puzzle, we want two numbers that multiply to be a times c and add to be bx. Well, a would be 2, b would be -5, and c would be -3. So we want two numbers that multiply to be a -6, and we want two numbers that add to be a -5. Well, 6 doesn't have very many factors, so we can look at these. We want them to multiply to be a negative number, which means one is negative, and one will be positive. Well, if I have a -2 and a +3, that's going to be +1. If I have a +2 and a -3, that's going to be -1. If I have a +1 and a -6, that's -5. That's exactly what I'm looking for. So we are going to have the factors of -6 times +1 is -6, and -6 plus 1 is -5. And again, we just did that through trial and error. And now we're ready to factor. Well, we can factor an x out, That first term is negative, so I'm going to factor a negative out. Looking at 6 and 3, we can factor a 3 out. Then looking at our columns, 2 and negative 6, we could factor a 2 out. X squared and x, we can factor an x out. X and negative 3, well, nothing, they don't have anything in common, so we can just factor a 1 out. You always have to factor something out, and so if you can't find anything to factor, you factor a 1. Putting it all together, we have our greatest common factor of 3x. We have x minus 3 and 2x plus 1. So our factored form would be 3x times x minus 3 times 2x plus 1. And this is how you factor when you're looking at your greatest common factor and using your box method. And you always, always, always factor out that greatest common factor.